10 disturbing facts about the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the world changed forever, not through war, not through revolution, but through something invisible, something that crossed oceans and mountains and city walls with perfect, terrifying ease. The Black Death killed perhaps half of Europe. It emptied cities, silenced cathedral bells, and left entire villages with no one left to bury the dead. But the statistics alone cannot prepare you for the reality of what happened. Today, we uncover 10 disturbing facts about the Black Death. Facts that history classes rarely teach, and that will change how you think about the medieval world forever. Welcome to Relic and Ruin. Fact 1. 200 million dead. We often talk about the Black Death as a European catastrophe, and it was, but it was far more than that. The plague originated in Central Asia and swept through China, India, the Middle East, and North Africa before it ever reached Europe. Modern historians estimate that the total global death toll may have been as high as 200 million people. To put that in perspective, the entire population of the world at that time was perhaps 400 million. The Black Death may have killed 1 in every 2 people alive on Earth. In China, the population dropped from around 120 million to around 65 million in just a few decades. Entire dynasties collapsed. Trade routes that had operated for centuries fell silent. The Black Death was not a European plague. It was a global catastrophe, the deadliest pandemic in human history, before or since. Fact 2. Bodies catapulted over city walls. The plague reached Europe through one of the most disturbing acts of biological warfare in recorded history. In 1346, a Mongol army was besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa on the northern shore of the Black Sea. The plague arrived in the Mongol camp and began killing soldiers at an alarming rate. According to a contemporary account by the Genoese notary Gabriele de Mussis, the Mongol commander ordered the bodies of the plague dead to be loaded onto catapults and hurled over the city walls into Kaffa. The intention was to infect the defenders, and it worked. The Genoese merchants inside the city began to die. Panicking, they abandoned Kaffa and boarded their ships. They sailed west, toward home, toward Italy. And with them, unknowingly, they carried the plague into the heart of Europe. One fleet of ships, one desperate retreat, and the course of history was changed forever. Fact 3. The terrifying bird mask doctors. If you were sick during the Black Death and a doctor came to your door, the sight would have been more terrifying than reassuring. Plague doctors, the physicians who treated plague patients, wore one of the most distinctive and disturbing outfits in medical history. A long, waxed leather coat covering the entire body, gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, and a mask shaped like the beak of a bird, filled with aromatic herbs and spices. The beak mask was not decorative, it was functional. Or, at least doctors believed it was. The prevailing medical theory of the time held that disease spread through bad air. Miasma. The herbs stuffed into the beak were intended to filter and purify the air the doctor breathed, protecting them from infection. It did not work. The plague was not spread through bad air. It was spread through flea bites. But the costume did provide some incidental protection. The waxed leather made it harder for fleas to bite through, and the mask kept the doctor from touching their face. These figures became iconic symbols of the plague years. In the streets of medieval cities, when you saw the beak mask approaching, you knew what it meant. Death was nearby. Fact 4. People threw parties as the plague arrived. When faced with certain death, humans respond in remarkably different ways. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence, described how the city's population split into distinct camps. Some became intensely devout, praying, fasting, attending church constantly, convinced that religious observance might save them. Others took the exact opposite approach. Boccaccio described groups of men and women who reasoned that since death was inevitable, they might as well enjoy whatever time remained. They gathered in houses, drank wine, sang songs, and refused to think about tomorrow. They moved from house to house, taking pleasure wherever they found it, caring nothing for the future. Both approaches failed equally. The devout died alongside the revelers. The plague did not distinguish between the pious and the sinful, the cautious and the reckless. But the impulse to celebrate in the face of death, to insist on the value of pleasure and company and laughter, even when the world is ending, is one of the most human responses imaginable, and in its own way, one of the most courageous. Fact 5. Nobody could outrun it. The most common response to the Black Death was flight. Get away from the city. Get away from the sick. Find somewhere safe. It did not work, because the people who fled carried the plague with them. The Black Death spread at the speed of human movement, the speed of a ship crossing the Mediterranean, the speed of a merchant caravan moving along a trade route, the speed of a family loading their belongings onto a cart and leaving the city behind. In some cases, the plague moved faster than news of it. People arrived in villages that had not yet heard of the disease, were welcomed in, and within days the village was dying. Modern analysis of the plague's spread across Europe suggests it advanced at roughly 1 to 6 kilometers per day, faster along trade routes and rivers, slower in remote and sparsely populated areas. In a world without motor vehicles, that was remarkably fast. There was nowhere to run to. The plague was already there, or it was coming. The only question was when. Fact 6. Bodies piled up in the streets. In ordinary times, death in a medieval city was a managed ceremonial affair. The body was washed and dressed. Prayers were said. A procession accompanied the coffin to the church. The dead were buried individually, with their names recorded, their souls prayed for. And the Black Death made all of that impossible. In Florence, at the height of the epidemic, 500 people were dying every day. The graveyards filled within weeks. New burial pits were dug outside the city walls. Long trenches into which bodies were laid in layers, covered with a little earth, then more bodies placed on top. In some cities, bodies simply lay in the streets because there was no one left to collect them. The living were too few, too frightened or too sick themselves to manage the dead. The writer Agnolo di Tura, describing the plague in Siena, wrote words that have haunted historians ever since. He wrote that he buried his 5 children with his own hands, and he could find no one to help him. 5 children with his own hands. That sentence contains an entire world of grief. Fact 7. The Church lost its authority. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the unquestioned center of European life. It explained the world. It provided comfort. It promised that faith and virtue would be rewarded. The Black Death challenged that promise with brutal directness. Priests died. Bishops died. Monks and nuns in their monasteries and convents died. sometimes entire communities wiped out within days. The men and women who were supposed to be closest to God were dying at the same rate as everyone else, in some areas at a higher rate, because their pastoral duties brought them into constant contact with the sick and dying. The faithful prayed. They made pilgrimages. They confessed their sins and attended Mass, and did everything the Church had taught them to do. And they died anyway. The questions that arose from this were ones the Church struggled to answer. If prayer did not protect the faithful, what was prayer for? If God had allowed this, what did that say about God's mercy? Most people did not abandon their faith, but the unquestioning certainty of the high Middle Ages began to crack. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation, which would shatter the unity of European Christianity 2 centuries later, were partly planted in the plague years. Fact 8. Some survivors inherited enormous wealth. The Black Death was the greatest human catastrophe in history. It was also, for a small number of survivors, an extraordinary economic opportunity. When a third to a half of the population dies in a short period of time, wealth does not disappear with them. It is redistributed. Houses, land, businesses, gold, all of it passes to whoever survives. In some cases, a single person inherited the accumulated wealth of an entire extended family. A younger son who would have received nothing under normal circumstances suddenly found himself the heir to everything. A servant whose employer had no surviving relatives might inherit a house or a business. This unexpected redistribution of wealth created a new class of newly prosperous people across Europe, people who had neither the upbringing nor the social connections of the wealthy, but who suddenly had the money. They spent it on food, on clothing, on art, on the pleasures that money can buy. Historians have argued that this sudden democratization of wealth was one of the forces that drove the cultural flowering of the Renaissance, that the new money flowing through European society created new markets for art and luxury goods and helped to fund the explosion of creativity that followed the plague years. Out of the greatest catastrophe came, in part, one of the greatest cultural achievements in human history. History is never simple. Fact 9. It changed the English language forever. Here is a fact about the Black Death that almost no one knows. Before the plague, England was effectively a trilingual country. The nobility spoke French, the language of the Norman conquerors who had arrived in 1066. The church conducted its affairs in Latin, and the ordinary people spoke English, a rough Germanic language that was considered too common for literature or official use. The Black Death killed so many of the French-speaking nobility and the Latin-educated clergy that the social dominance of those languages was fatally weakened. The survivors, largely English speakers, filled the vacuum. English began its rise as the language of government, of literature, of public life. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in English in the decades after the plague, was part of this transformation. His Canterbury Tales, one of the greatest works in the English language, would not have been written in English, or would not have found the audience it found without the demographic upheaval that the plague caused. The language you are listening to right now was shaped in part by the Black Death. Every word of English is a small monument to the survivors of 1348. Fact 10. the plague still exists today. Here is the most disturbing fact of all. The Black Death did not end. It still exists. The bacterium that caused it, Yersinia pestis, is still present in the world today. It lives in rodent populations in Central Asia, in parts of Africa, and in the American Southwest. Occasional human cases still occur, a few hundred per year globally, mostly in rural areas where people come into contact with infected animals. In the United States, between 1 and 17 cases of plague are reported every year. In 2015, a tourist in Yosemite National Park contracted plague from a flea bite. In 2019, a couple in Mongolia died of plague after eating raw marmot meat. The difference between then and now is antibiotics. Treated promptly with modern medication, plague is survivable. Untreated, it is still as lethal as it ever was. The bacterium that emptied medieval cities and killed perhaps 200 million people is still out there, still circulating, still waiting. We have not defeated it. We have only learned to treat it. 10 facts, 10 windows into one of the most devastating events in human history. But behind every fact is a person, a specific, irreplaceable human being who woke up one morning not knowing that their world was about to end, who loved their children and feared the future and tried, with everything they had, to survive. Most of them did not, but some did. And it is from those survivors, broken, diminished, forever changed, that the modern world was built. If this video made you think differently about the past, subscribe to Relic and Ruin. Every week, we go deeper into the stories that history forgot. The past is waiting. Let's dig it up.